SpongeBob is remembered for bright colors, strange jokes, jellyfishing, and problems that usually disappear before the credits. Yet Bikini Bottom has always made room for ghosts, transformations, replacements, broken timelines, and ideas that become stranger when the jokes are examined closely. In this video, we break down 10 SpongeBob horror theories. The ghost story that accidentally becomes real. Graveyard shift Squidward knows SpongeBob is easy to scare, making an empty Krusty Krab the perfect place for a fake ghost story. He invents a killer and a list of warning signs, only for those same signs to begin appearing inside the restaurant after he admits the story is fake. This is the story of how Squidward loses control of his own prank as the night starts following rules he invented, leaving one final event his explanation cannot account for. Graveyard Shift appeared during SpongeBob SquarePants Season 2 in September 2002, and the story begins when Mr. Krabs decides the Krusty Krab can make more money by staying open 24 hours a day. SpongeBob treats the change like a gift because he gets to remain in his favorite workplace through the night, keep serving customers, and experience a part of the job he has never had before, while Squidward sees the same decision as another way for Mr. Krabs to take control of his time. The restaurant that normally empties after closing now has no closing hour, and although nothing dangerous has happened, the darkness outside changes how familiar rooms feel. The register, grill, doors, tables, and kitchen remain exactly where they belong, yet being awake inside the Krusty Krab when the rest of Bikini Bottom has gone quiet gives Squidward a setting where SpongeBob is already easier to unsettle. Squidward notices that nervousness and decides to entertain himself by telling SpongeBob about a former fry cook who supposedly lost a hand, replaced it with a rusty spatula, was hit by a bus, and now returns to the Krusty Krab seeking revenge. He calls the figure the hash-slinging slasher, then builds the story around details SpongeBob can recognize inside the room around them. The lights will flicker first, the telephone will ring with nobody speaking on the other end, a bus will arrive outside even though it should not be running that late, and a shadowy figure carrying a spatula will finally approach the restaurant. Squidward creates each sign because he understands that fear becomes easier to believe when it comes with a pattern, and SpongeBob immediately begins treating the list as something he may actually have to watch for. Once SpongeBob is frightened enough, Squidward admits that he invented the whole story, which should restore his control over the situation because the monster has no history beyond the prank he just performed. He has demonstrated how easily SpongeBob can be scared and can now return to a quiet shift behind the register, but the restaurant begins repeating the same sequence without Squidward's help. The lights begin flickering first, giving SpongeBob the opening sign from the story, and making Squidward less comfortable once his invented pattern appears without his involvement. The telephone then rings, and nobody speaks when Squidward answers, adding another sign in the order he described. When a bus finally pulls up outside, the pattern becomes difficult for Squidward to ignore because the most specific part of his invented legend has appeared exactly when his story said it would. Squidward's reaction is important because he never loses the knowledge that the slasher story came from him. He is not remembering a legend from childhood or discovering that another worker once told the same tale. He knows every detail exists because he selected it for SpongeBob, yet knowledge of that origin does not stop the emotional effect once the same details begin appearing outside his control. His fear grows from the possibility that something impossible is matching a story that should have no independent reality. The more exact the sequence becomes, the harder it is for him to treat each event as separate, even though the audience already knows that coincidence remains a possible explanation. A shadowy figure steps from the bus and walks toward the Krusty Krab carrying something that resembles a spatula, which leaves SpongeBob and Squidward retreating farther into the restaurant while the roles between them begin to collapse. Squidward can no longer stand outside the prank and enjoy SpongeBob's fear because he is now using his own fiction to predict what the stranger may do. The same details that gave him control a few minutes earlier are working against him, and even their usual emotional distance weakens as both characters begin acting like the threat could be real. Believing that someone may be coming to kill them, they start confessing small things to each other, and although the confessions remain funny, the behavior shows how seriously Squidward has begun treating a monster he knows he personally invented. When the stranger finally enters, most of the horror story collapses through ordinary explanation. The visitor is a nervous young man who has come to apply for a job, and the object in his hand is a spatula because he hopes to work at the restaurant. He explains that he called earlier and hung up because he became nervous, while the bus simply provided transportation to the Krusty Krab. The telephone, bus, figure, and spatula were all real, yet their frightening meaning came from the story Squidward placed around them. Once the applicant explains why he is there, the same events become ordinary again, and the episode has spent most of its suspense demonstrating how easily a pattern can turn unrelated details into evidence once people already know what they expect to see. The applicant should end the mystery because nearly every frightening sign now has a normal cause, but Squidward notices that nobody has explained why the lights kept flickering. The applicant did not touch them, SpongeBob was standing beside Squidward, and the story has already reached the point where the rational explanation explanation should be complete. Instead, the camera leaves the employees and reveals Count Orlok from Nosferatu standing beside the light switch, casually flicking it on and off while smiling. The hash-slinging slasher never appears as a real killer, and the visitor turns out to be harmless, yet the remaining unexplained event receives a supernatural cause that Squidward never included in his own legend. His fake monster disappears under examination, while something impossible has actually been standing nearby the whole time. That final image gives the theory a much narrower and stronger claim than saying Squidward accidentally invented a real ghost story. The episode never provides an old record of the hash-slinging slasher, another witness, a grave, a newspaper article, or any independent sign that a dead fry cook returned for revenge, because every part of the legend comes from Squidward after he decides to frighten SpongeBob. The supernatural evidence belongs to Count Orlok, whose existence fits a series that already contains the Flying Dutchman, curses, monsters, and other impossible creatures. Later appearances make Orlok more than a single unexplained frame by bringing him back into SpongeBob's world, which supports the idea that the vampire can exist in Bikini Bottom even though his appearance does nothing to confirm Squidward's invented killer. The nervous applicant also shows why the slasher theory can feel convincing before the final reveal. He carries the correct kind of object because someone applying for a fry cook job might reasonably have a spatula, he arrives by bus because he needs transportation, and he made the strange phone call because nerves caused him to hang up before speaking. Each fact has an ordinary explanation independent of the ghost story. Yet the moment Squidward arranges those facts into a sequence, the normal explanation becomes harder for him to see. He knows the legend is false because he created it, yet he becomes frightened anyway once the world begins matching the structure he described, showing that knowing where a frightening story came from does not always stop the mind from reacting when familiar details suddenly seem to prove it. That pattern becomes even clearer when Squidward's behavior is compared with SpongeBob's. SpongeBob believes first because he trusts the story, then reacts to every sign according to the rules Squidward gave him. Squidward begins from the opposite position because he knows the story is false, but repeated matching details gradually push his behavior towards SpongeBob's until both characters are hiding from the same approaching figure. They arrive at fear from different directions, which gives the episode more weight than a simple prank that backfires. SpongeBob is frightened because he lacks the knowledge Squidward has, while Squidward is frightened because the knowledge he has stops feeling sufficient once the environment seems to contradict it. Count Orlok arrives after that lesson has already played out, so his presence adds a second layer without erasing the first one. SpongeBob and Squidward were wrong to treat every sign as evidence of the hash-slinging slasher, because the applicant explains most of what they saw, but the episode still allows a real supernatural figure to exist inside the same night. That combination fits SpongeBob's wider rules better than forcing the story into a completely rational or completely supernatural answer. Characters can misread ordinary events because fear gives them a pattern, while Bikini Bottom remains strange enough for an actual vampire to stand beside a light switch without the universe stopping to explain how he got there. The production history supports keeping the final scare focused on its function rather than building a larger secret mythology around Orlok. Early material connected the light switch ending to a different strange figure before the finished version used Nosferatu, which suggests that the scene was designed to preserve one impossible detail after the ordinary explanations arrived. The joke needed something outside the slasher story that Squidward could not have predicted, and Count Orlok provides exactly that before disappearing. Treating him as the hidden mastermind behind every earlier event would add a role the episode never gives him, because the applicant still explains the telephone, bus, figure, and spatula, leaving Orlok responsible only for the one action the story deliberately keeps unresolved until the final shot. That production choice also shows why the ending works without a long explanation of who Orlok is or how he reached Bikini Bottom. The point of the scene depends on recognition and surprise rather than lore. The story has just trained the audience to expect a complete ordinary explanation, then it leaves one small mechanical action unresolved and answers it with an obviously supernatural figure, explaining his route to the Krusty Krab, his reason for flicking the switch, or his connection to local supernatural characters would shift attention away from the reversal. The lack of explanation keeps the final image operating as one stubborn fact that does not fit inside the ordinary account the applicant has just provided. That limit makes Graveyard Shift useful as the first theory in the video because it establishes how evidence will be handled from here forward. A frightening interpretation can lose most of its support while one strange piece survives, and a theory does not become stronger by claiming more than the episode shows. Squidward's monster remains fictional, yet the restaurant still contains a supernatural presence. The applicant is innocent, yet Squidward and SpongeBob were not wrong that something impossible was happening. The strongest conclusion sits between those facts, where ordinary explanations remove most of the fear, while the last unexplained light flicker turns out to have a real vampire standing behind it. The night also changes the Krusty Krab itself for a few minutes, without requiring any permanent shift in the series. At the beginning, the dark restaurant is only a setting Squidward can use to manipulate SpongeBob, but by the end, it has contained a fake legend, a misunderstood stranger, and an actual vampire within the same short stretch of time. SpongeBob's willingness to believe scary stories makes him easy to frighten, while Squidward's confidence proves just as fragile once the environment begins matching the story he wrote. The episode keeps both characters recognizable because SpongeBob never becomes a skeptic and Squidward never becomes a believer in every ghost tale. Yet their shared panic reveals how quickly certainty can disappear when a familiar place begins behaving according to a frightening pattern. The light switch becomes the best object to carry the section's ending because it is smaller than every threat Squidward described. There is no undead fry cook walking toward the register, no revenge plot, and no hidden history of a murderer returning to the restaurant. Yet the switch keeps moving for a reason nobody in the room can explain. When the camera finally reveals Orlok, the answer proves that the impossible part of the night was real, while also showing that Squidward had been looking in the wrong direction. His invented monster controlled what he expected to see, and the actual supernatural presence remained outside that story until the last few seconds. That balance keeps Graveyard Shift from becoming either a full debunking or a full confirmation. The episode rationally explains most of its apparent ghost evidence and then deliberately preserves one supernatural fact, allowing both the fear and the correction to matter. SpongeBob and Squidward survive the shift. The applicant remains an ordinary nervous person, and the restaurant can return to normal by the next episode, but the final image leaves one concrete detail behind that the joke cannot fully take back. A vampire really was inside the Krusty Krab, and he really was operating the lights. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One real vampire survives after Squidward's ghost story falls apart. Across the street, another horror theory begins with something far more ordinary. Plankton's Menu, a disgusting restaurant name, and one word that sounds much worse when fish are the customers. Section 2. Is the chum bucket feeding fish to fish? The cannibalism theory. Plankton spends most of the series trying to sell food Bikini Bottom already finds disgusting. The name chum bucket makes the joke darker because chum can include fish, and an official newspaper later prints a similar accusation serious enough to shut his restaurant down. This is the story of how a gross menu joke becomes a cannibalism rumor inside Bikini Bottom, forcing its strongest piece of evidence to be tested against the episode that created it before the claim can be treated as fact. For years, the strongest evidence seemed to be the word itself, until the Krabby Chronicle created something much closer to a direct accusation. The episode follows Mr. Krabs after he discovers that newspapers can make money and turns the Krusty Krab into a small news operation, with SpongeBob becoming the reporter responsible for filling each issue. SpongeBob initially tries to report normal events from around Bikini Bottom, but truthful local stories do not produce the sales Mr. Krabs wants, so the paper begins moving towards sensational claims that attract more attention. SpongeBob becomes increasingly uncomfortable as ordinary residents are turned into embarrassing or alarming headlines, yet Mr. Krabs keeps rewarding stories that sell, establishing a clear pattern where the newspaper's most dramatic claims are invented because profit matters more than accuracy. The chum bucket sits directly across from the Krusty Krab and has always been built around a simple food rivalry. Mr. Krabs sells Krabby Patties that customers love enough to form lines for, while Plankton sells chum that regularly disgusts the same public before he can finish a sales pitch. The restaurant name works as part of the joke because chum can also mean a friend, which is especially fitting for a business run by one of the loneliest and least popular characters in town. The fishing meaning creates the darker possibility, since chum can describe material scattered into water to attract fish, and can include chopped fish along with other animal or vegetable matter. That real definition gives the theory an opening, although it also prevents the easy claim that chum always means dead fish, because the term covers more than one kind of bait. The visual design of the chum bucket helps the theory because the restaurant already feels like the place where Bikini Bottom's food rules have gone wrong. Plankton serves from a metal building shaped like a bucket, works with industrial equipment, and presents meals that look processed rather than fresh, while the Krusty Krab is framed as the town's familiar fast food stop. Those choices make Plankton's food easier to imagine as something assembled from unpleasant ingredients, but visual disgust is still different from identifying a source. The restaurant can look threatening without the show establishing that the product comes from other citizens. The show keeps Plankton's exact recipe vague enough for that opening to stay alive. His food appears in processed, old, wet, lumpy, and deliberately unappealing forms, and the people of Bikini Bottom usually respond to it with disgust. Yet the series never gives one stable ingredient list that can be tracked from episode to episode. That uncertainty allows fans to imagine the worst, especially when the product is being sold to fish. But the theory begins adding unsupported material as soon as it claims Plankton must be using missing residents, dead customers, or known characters as ingredients. The restaurant name creates an uncomfortable association, and the food's appearance strengthens the atmosphere. here, while proof of actual cannibalism would require evidence that identifies what Plankton puts into the chum rather than simply showing that nobody wants to eat it. Plankton eventually becomes one of those targets when SpongeBob publishes a story suggesting that the chum bucket serves people's friends as chum. Inside the episode, the accusation produces a real consequence because a health inspector responds to the article and shuts down Plankton's restaurant, creating an image that can look like perfect confirmation when removed from the surrounding plot. An official newspaper exists inside SpongeBob's world. The paper directly links Plankton's food to other residents, and an authority figure treats the claim seriously enough to close the business. Someone searching only for screenshots or isolated lines could easily present the scene as evidence that the show confirmed cannibalism, especially because the accusation uses the same double meaning that has fueled the fan theory for years. The surrounding story removes that certainty because SpongeBob never investigates Plankton's kitchen or discovers a hidden ingredient list before writing the article. He does not find bodies, interview witnesses, inspect a processing room, or receive any confession from Plankton, and the story belongs to the same wave of fabricated reporting that has already hurt other residents. Plankton protests the closure because he has done nothing to deserve it, while Mr. Krabs responds by praising SpongeBob's imagination, which places the accusation directly inside the episode's larger problem with invented news. The health inspector's involvement also fails to strengthen the underlying claim because he acts on information he believes to be true, just as other residents react to false stories about themselves throughout the episode. The episode's treatment of other newspaper stories provides a useful control for the Plankton headline because the audience watches SpongeBob produce claims whose harm comes from being believed rather than from being true. The paper repeatedly turns ordinary people into targets by exaggerating or inventing material that gives readers something scandalous to react to. Mrs. Puff's business is damaged, Larry is pushed out of the gym, and Sandy's science trophies are confiscated after similar stories are treated as true. Plankton's article belongs to that same system, so isolating it from the surrounding stories removes the very information the episode uses to teach the audience how the newspaper works. The accusation sounds believable because Plankton's food already looks suspicious, which is exactly why it succeeds as false reporting. The Krabby Chronicle eventually makes the difference between invented scandal and truthful reporting central to its resolution. SpongeBob sees how much damage the paper is causing, turns against Mr. Krabs' demands, and begins using real information to expose what his boss has been doing. Plankton's cannibalism accusation appears before that correction and functions as one of the clearest examples of a false story producing a real consequence. The restaurant closes because people believe the article, which shows how powerful the rumor becomes once it is printed and acted upon, but the closure does not transform the rumor into evidence about the food. In this case, the consequence is real while the claim behind it remains unsupported. That still leaves the name chum bucket and the real fishing definition, which means the theory does not disappear completely when the newspaper article is restored to context. Chum can contain fish, Plankton does serve something called chum, and the show intentionally uses the double meaning of chum as both bait and friend when SpongeBob writes the fake story. Those facts show that the writers were aware of the dark joke and considered the idea recognizable enough to build a headline around it. The episode therefore confirms the existence of the cannibal reading as comedy inside SpongeBob's world, even while refusing to confirm that the reading accurately describes Plankton's recipe. Later stories keep the food disgusting without supplying the missing proof. Plankton can store old chum, struggle to dispose of it, serve it in unpleasant forms, and become trapped, dealing with the same product his customers reject. But none of those situations gives a dependable list of ingredients showing that Bikini Bottom residents are being processed into meals. The series is much more interested in the running joke that Plankton cannot sell his food than in maintaining a technical explanation for how chum is manufactured. That lack of consistency means individual gross details can support atmosphere while remaining too weak to carry a murder or cannibalism claim on their own. The rumor becomes stronger only when several simplified statements are repeated together. Someone says chum means chopped fish, then remembers that the customers are fish, then recalls that SpongeBob once printed a headline accusing Plankton of serving people's friends, and finally points to the health inspector shutting the restaurant down. Each step sounds like another layer of confirmation until the original scenes are restored. Chum has more than one possible composition. The show leaves the recipe unclear, the headline is fabricated, and the inspector responds to bad information rather than a verified kitchen discovery. The theory gains power through accumulation, but the evidence becomes weaker once each piece is examined separately. Plankton's reputation also explains why the accusation can spread inside the episode without requiring any proof. Bikini Bottom already knows him as a thief, schemer, inventor, and repeated enemy of the Krusty Krab, so a grotesque story about his restaurant attaches itself to a person the town is already prepared to distrust. The newspaper takes advantage of that reputation in the same way sensational reporting often relies on what an audience is already willing to believe about a target. Plankton can can therefore become a victim of false reporting in this specific story, even though he behaves badly in many others. And his usual villain role should not be used as replacement evidence for a crime this episode never shows. The health inspector scene makes that problem especially clear because official action can make a weak accusation look stronger from the outside. Once the restaurant has been closed by someone with authority, the image itself seems to validate the headline, yet the episode has already established that the inspector is relying on the newspaper rather than conducting an independent investigation. The closure becomes evidence of the rumor's power, not evidence of the recipe. That distinction is easy to lose when a theory is passed around through screenshots, summaries, or short clips, because the consequence remains visible after the reason it should not be trusted has been removed. The most accurate conclusion, therefore, stays narrower than the popular version of the theory. Plankton serves food deliberately presented as disgusting. The name of his restaurant carries a fishing meaning that can involve fish, and SpongeBob once published the exact kind of cannibal accusation fans had already imagined. The article itself was invented, and the series never supplies a reliable scene showing Plankton grinding residents into chum. The full ingredient list remains vague enough that the show cannot provide a clean answer about every substance inside his food, but uncertainty about a fictional recipe cannot be expanded into confirmed murder without evidence the episodes never give. That narrower conclusion also keeps the Krabby Chronicle from being reduced to a hidden lore clue when its main story is about misinformation. SpongeBob's article hurts Plankton because a disgusting accusation sounds believable enough to spread, and the episode uses the damage caused by those stories to force SpongeBob into recognizing what Mr. Krabs has asked him to do. The cannibal headline serves that purpose perfectly because it turns a familiar restaurant joke into a claim serious enough to destroy a business. Its role in the episode depends on the public believing something that was never investigated, which makes using the article as proof repeat the exact mistake the story is criticizing. The double meaning of chum also explains why the line remains memorable even after the article is exposed. A single word can connect bait, friendship, food, and cannibalism without the show needing to explain any of those links in detail. The writers can make the joke land because the audience already understands enough of the word to feel the implication, while the surrounding plot can immediately frame the accusation as a product of SpongeBob's imagination. That balance lets the series acknowledge how disturbing the restaurant name can sound without rewriting Plankton into a secret killer. Plankton already commits enough visible wrongdoing across the series that the absence of comparable evidence matters here. When he steals, spies, builds dangerous machines, disguises himself, or tries to control someone, SpongeBob usually shows the behavior openly because the plot depends on it. A hidden operation turning citizens into food would be a much larger crime, yet no victim is identified, no body is discovered, no recurring customer disappears into a processing machine, and no episode builds a reveal around Plankton secretly serving residents back to the town. The theory remains possible only in the broad sense that the show never publishes a permanent recipe, which is far weaker than the claim that cannibalism has been confirmed. The newspaper becomes the best object to carry the section's ending because it demonstrates how frightening evidence can look when context disappears. Read alone, the page appears to reveal the chum bucket's secret and even causes an official closure. Put back into the episode, the same page becomes evidence that SpongeBob was fabricating stories under pressure from Mr. Krabs. The rumor survives because the restaurant name and real-world meaning of chum still sound uncomfortable, but the show has already told us that its clearest accusation came from a lie. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The chum bucket leaves its darkest ingredient unproven because no victim ever appears. Inside SpongeBob's home, a syringe meant for Gary removes that uncertainty by changing SpongeBob's body in front of Squidward, one symptom at a time. Section 3. The injection that rewrites SpongeBob's species. I was a teenage Gary. SpongeBob normally cares for Gary as a pet who depends on him, but one medical mistake reverses that relationship. Medicine meant for Gary enters SpongeBob instead, and his appetite, movement, voice, and body begin changing, while Squidward hopes the accident will pass. This is the story of how a treatment meant for a snail changes SpongeBob piece by piece until his body no longer matches the person who received the injection, with his mind becoming harder to read as the transformation continues. I Was a Teenage Gary appeared during SpongeBob SquarePants Season 1 in October 1999, and the story begins when SpongeBob and Patrick prepare to leave town for a jellyfishing convention. Gary cannot come with them, so SpongeBob asks Squidward to watch the snail during the trip, trusting his neighbor with a routine that should involve little more than providing the care Gary normally receives at home. Squidward accepts without sharing SpongeBob's sense of responsibility, and the consequences only become clear once SpongeBob returns to find Gary weak and visibly unwell. A veterinarian is called, and the solution arrives in a controlled form through snail plasma delivered by syringe, giving Squidward one simple responsibility after already failing the first one: make sure the treatment reaches the correct patient. Squidward's neglect matters because it creates creates the chain of responsibility before anything supernatural or medical happens. SpongeBob leaves Gary with specific trust in a neighbor he sees every day, and Gary's condition on SpongeBob's return shows that the ordinary care failed before the extraordinary accident begins. That sequence keeps the plasma from feeling like a random curse dropped into the story. One missed responsibility leads to a sick pet. The sick pet brings a veterinarian and a syringe into the pineapple, and the same person who neglected Gary is then placed in charge of administering the treatment, allowing one careless decision to build directly into the next. The plasma is meant for Gary, and the episode's fictional medical logic treats the connection as straightforward enough that nobody expects the substance to affect another species. SpongeBob stays close because he is worried about his pet, while Squidward handles the syringe in a crowded moment and accidentally injects the plasma into SpongeBob instead. The mistake is obvious as soon as it happens, but the consequences do not arrive all at once, allowing Squidward to reassure SpongeBob that he will probably be fine and giving both characters a reason to hope the accident can be ignored. That delay turns the transformation into a process rather than a single visual gag, because SpongeBob has time to remain recognizably himself while the first signs begin appearing. Those early signs are small enough to dismiss individually, but specific enough to point in one direction when they begin accumulating. SpongeBob becomes interested in Gary's food, his movements start changing, and the sounds coming from him begin drifting toward the kind of meowing normally associated with his pet. The problem keeps spreading through different parts of his behavior, which makes the plasma look less like something causing a temporary illness and more like something reorganizing how SpongeBob's body operates. He can still recognize Squidward, react to the situation, and understand that something is wrong, but the habits he has used his entire life are slowly being replaced by responses that belong to Gary's side of the household. The physical changes deepen that pattern because SpongeBob's posture lowers, his limbs stop behaving the way he expects, and his usual upright square shape becomes harder to maintain. SpongeBob's body normally survives stretching, flattening, swelling, tearing, and dozens of other cartoon distortions before returning to its familiar form, yet this change keeps moving in one direction without the usual snapback. His appetite follows the same path when Gary's food becomes attractive to him, which means the plasma appears to be changing more than appearance alone. Eating, moving, sounding, and responding like a snail begin developing together, making it increasingly difficult for Squidward to pretend that the accidental injection has no serious effect. The transformation also changes activities that normally help define SpongeBob as SpongeBob. He is usually upright, verbal, eager to work, quick to explain himself, and physically expressive through hands and legs that let him cook, gesture, and run through town. As the plasma takes effect, those ordinary tools of identity become less available, so the audience is not only watching a new shape appear. The episode gradually removes the behaviors through which SpongeBob usually proves who he is to everyone around him. That loss becomes clearest when speech gives way to meowing, because the body can still look familiar in color and expression, while his normal way of communicating has almost disappeared. Speech becomes one of the most important changes because it is the easiest way for SpongeBob to show how much of his old self remains accessible. Early in the transformation, he can still react to Squidward and recognize that the symptoms are happening to him, which gives the audience direct evidence that SpongeBob's identity has survived the first stages. As the process continues, normal words give way to snail sounds, and the meowing that usually tells SpongeBob what Gary needs begins coming from SpongeBob himself. Once language disappears, the audience loses its clearest access to the person inside the changing body, even though his expressions and familiar coloring still make the transformed creature recognizably SpongeBob. The transformation reaches its high point when SpongeBob becomes fully snail-like, losing the physical form that normally lets him cook, work, walk upright, use his hands, and move through Bikini Bottom as himself. Gary remains nearby as a visual measuring point because the behavior SpongeBob is developing has always been harmless and ordinary when Gary performs it. Meowing, eating snail food, moving close to the ground, and depending on others are normal parts of Gary's life. Yet the same traits become disturbing when they appear one after another in SpongeBob without his consent. The episode creates body horror through that misplaced familiarity, using ordinary pet behavior as evidence that the owner is becoming physically closer to the pet with every scene. Gary's role also keeps the transformation from turning snails themselves into the frightening element. Gary becomes sick after Squidward fails to care for him, and the plasma exists to help him recover, which means the treatment only becomes dangerous after it crosses into a body it was never intended to enter. SpongeBob's affection for Gary never disappears, but the accident removes the distance that normally allows one of them to care for the other. By the time SpongeBob is fully transformed, the household no longer has a clear caretaker standing upright and speaking normally, because the person who should have been helping Gary now requires help himself. Squidward eventually becomes exposed as well, allowing the episode to push the accident beyond SpongeBob's body before the ending. The person who neglected Gary and mishandled the treatment is pulled into the same condition, and the final image places Gary, transformed SpongeBob, and transformed Squidward together as snail-like figures. figures. That ending confirms the physical effect strongly enough that the theory does not need help from rumors, symbolism, or a disturbing name. A substance intended for a snail enters SpongeBob. His body and behavior progressively change, and Squidward later ends in a similar state after exposure. Squidward's later transformation also changes how his earlier dismissal reads. He spends much of the episode treating SpongeBob's symptoms as a problem he would rather avoid, which leaves him standing at a distance from the consequences until the same transformation begins affecting him. Once he begins changing too, that distance disappears. The condition can no longer be treated as SpongeBob behaving strangely because Squidward is now subject to the same rules, and his participation gives the episode a second case showing that the plasma's effect is repeatable within the story rather than a unique reaction caused by SpongeBob alone. The uncertainty begins when the theory moves from the body into the mind. SpongeBob clearly remains himself enough during the early stages to notice his symptoms and react to Squidward, but later his speech disappears, his preferences shift, and his movement becomes increasingly snail-like. Those facts show that behavior changes with anatomy, yet they do not tell us whether SpongeBob's original thoughts have been erased, trapped behind a body that can no longer express them, or altered along with everything else. The episode never provides internal narration, a dream sequence, or a later conversation where SpongeBob describes what the completed transformation felt like, so the condition of his consciousness remains outside what the story confirms. Real biology cannot solve that missing piece because the snail plasma belongs to cartoon medicine, rather than a process that can be mapped onto real species change. Trying to explain SpongeBob's transformation through genetics, blood chemistry, or realistic plasma would create scientific claims the episode never makes, while the fictional evidence is already clear enough on its own. The injection begins the process. The symptoms accumulate in a consistent direction, and the final body resembles a snail. The theory therefore has a strong physical foundation and a limited psychological conclusion, with the unanswered part staying exactly where the episode leaves it. The title also points toward older transformation horror. I Was a Teenage Gary echoes the 1957 film I Was a Teenage Werewolf, connecting the episode to a familiar monster movie idea. The pacing strengthens the horror because the transformation gives SpongeBob time to experience the loss in stages. An instant magical change could be played as a single absurd image, but I Was a Teenage Gary lets appetite shift before the final body is complete, lets the voice move toward meowing before normal speech disappears, and lets movement become unfamiliar before the last visual state settles. Each stage gives SpongeBob and Squidward another moment where they can hope the process has stopped, only for a new symptom to show that the plasma is still working. The result feels less like one joke happening to SpongeBob and more like his ordinary way of existing being replaced piece by piece. The final scene also withholds a recovery, which gives this transformation a different ending from many SpongeBob stories, where a magical object, machine, or final gag clearly restores the character before the credits. Future episodes obviously return SpongeBob and Squidward to their familiar bodies, because the series depends on that reset. But this specific story does not show how the reversal happens. Within the episode's last direct evidence, the transformation remains active, leaving the audience to move into later continuity without seeing whether the plasma wears off, requires another treatment, or simply disappears between stories. That gap also places a limit on a popular fan rumor involving supposedly deleted footage of Squidward's transformation. A 2022 post from writer Steve Fonte showed an original story outline in which Squidward's snail transformation was planned, but that does not prove a finished deleted sequence was completed or aired. The broadcast episode already gives enough material to establish that Squidward joins SpongeBob in the snail state without relying on the rumor. Adding unseen scenes would only weaken the section by making the theory depend on material the story does not need. The visible ending already provides the stronger point. Squidward becomes part of the same condition, and the episode closes before either transformed character returns to normal. Gary's meow becomes the best callback because it begins as an ordinary sound from SpongeBob's pet and ends as the language shared by all three figures in the final scene. Earlier, SpongeBob hears that sound as information from someone he cares for, while later, he can only produce the same kind of sound from inside a body that has stopped supporting his normal speech. The owner and pet have become physically similar enough that the sound no longer tells us who needs care and who is supposed to provide it. The strongest conclusion, therefore, stays close to what the episode actually lets the audience observe. Snail plasma changes SpongeBob's body, movement, appetite, and voice, while the final state prevents us from knowing how much of his old inner life remains accessible. The story does not confirm death, replacement, or the destruction of his mind, and it does not need any of those claims to remain unsettling. Watching SpongeBob recognize the process early and then lose the ability to describe it is already enough to make the transformation feel much darker than an ordinary cartoon mutation. By the ending, Gary is no longer the only character whose body matches the behaviors associated with a snail, and SpongeBob is no longer able to explain what the experience means from inside his new form. The episode leaves the physical change visible and the mental answer hidden, which is exactly where the theory should stop. Anything further would require inventing information the transformed SpongeBob never gets the chance to give us. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One syringe leaves SpongeBob's mind hidden behind a body that no longer matches his old species. Sandy's technology creates the opposite identity problem when two recognizable personalities remain active while a machine forces both of them into the same physical form. Section 4. The machine that traps two people in one body. SpongeBob Tentacle Pants. Squidward values privacy because distance is usually the easiest way to escape SpongeBob's attention. Sandy's teleportation experiment removes that option when the two neighbors are forced into one body while their voices, memories, and goals remain separate. This is the story of how a machine turns an ordinary boundary problem into a shared physical existence, then complicates the escape when the fused form gives Squidward the public attention he has wanted for years from people watching his performance. SpongeBob Tentacle Pants appeared during SpongeBob SquarePants Season 4 in 2005, and the story begins around one of Sandy's teleportation experiments. Her machine is supposed to remove distance by moving a person from one place to another, which gives SpongeBob exactly the kind of invention he is happy to try, and gives Squidward another reason to avoid whatever his neighbors are doing. The danger appears when the equipment tries to handle SpongeBob and Squidward together and produces something completely different from clean transportation. Instead of delivering two intact people, the machine combines them into a single body containing obvious physical features from both characters, making the failure visible before Sandy needs any instrument to tell her that the experiment has gone wrong. Sandy's role keeps the accident grounded in a machine with a clear intended purpose. She is not experimenting with fusion, personality transfer, or the creation of a new organism because the device is supposed to move intact subjects while preserving who they already are. The horror comes from a failure of sorting rather than from a successful invention doing something dangerous by design. Two people enter a system that should maintain their boundaries, and the machine returns one body containing parts of both, which gives Sandy a practical reason to treat separation as the correct outcome even before Squidward begins explaining how unbearable the condition feels. The fusion creates a different identity problem from SpongeBob's snail transformation because SpongeBob and Squidward remain mentally recognizable almost immediately. Both can speak, remember who they are, react to the accident, argue about what should happen, and express different goals, which gives direct evidence that the machine has merged their physical structures without instantly turning them into one personality. Their bodies have lost the separation that normally lets each character choose where to stand, where to go, and how much contact to have with the other person, while their minds remain distinct enough to resent sharing the same form. That loss becomes especially serious for Squidward because he has a clarinet recital ahead of him and wants to appear in public as the composed artist he believes himself to be. Sharing a body with SpongeBob threatens control over his performance, his movement, and the image he wants the audience to see, while SpongeBob approaches the novelty with much more curiosity. Even simple actions now require two sets of intentions to pass through one physical form, so the normal conflict between them has been moved from a neighborhood argument into anatomy. Squidward can usually shut a door, leave a room, or retreat into his house when SpongeBob becomes exhausting, but the fusion removes every ordinary route toward privacy. The shared body also turns coordination into a constant problem because intention is no longer private. SpongeBob and Squidward can disagree internally and immediately produce a physical struggle that neither could experience while standing several feet apart. One person may want to move toward an activity while the other wants to leave, yet both decisions have to pass through the same limbs and posture. The episode uses those conflicts for slapstick, but the repeated loss of control establishes something serious underneath the comedy. Retaining a separate personality does not help much when the body needed to act on that personality has become shared property. Sandy begins searching for a way to reverse the accident because the problem came from her equipment, eventually developing a molecular separator ray designed to pull the fused structure apart. Until that solution works, SpongeBob and Squidward remain attached closely enough that neither person can return to the life he normally controls, and the approaching recital gives Squidward a deadline that turns the condition from an embarrassing experiment into a public crisis. The machine has not merely changed how he looks, because it has taken away the physical independence he depends on whenever he wants to separate his own choices from SpongeBob's. The recital pushes the fused pair in front of an audience before the accident can become a private problem Sandy fixes in her lab. Squidward expects the strange body to humiliate him because it destroys the appearance he imagined for his performance, yet the crowd reacts to the combined creature with excitement. The same abnormal form that makes Squidward feel he has lost control suddenly gives him attention his ordinary playing rarely earns, which introduces a second desire into a situation that had previously seemed simple. Squidward wants his body back, but he also wants the recognition now attached to the condition he has spent the story trying to escape. Sandy's separator eventually restores SpongeBob and Squidward to their individual bodies, giving Squidward the physical independence he demanded from the beginning. He can stand alone, hold his clarinet without sharing his limbs, and present himself as the single performer he always wanted the audience to recognize, yet the attention fades once the fusion is gone. The crowd's fascination had been directed toward the strange combined form, leaving Squidward with the frustrating realization that regaining bodily control has also removed the public interest he finally received. The crowd's reaction creates a trap because Squidward cannot separate the attention he wants from the condition producing it. He has spent years believing that a larger audience would validate his talent, so the fused performance initially looks like the recognition he has been denied. The problem becomes visible once separation removes the spectacle and the enthusiasm disappears with it. Squidward is forced to confront the possibility that the audience came for the strange body rather than for the artistic identity he wanted them to admire, which helps explain why he becomes reckless enough to tamper with a machine that has already proved it can alter living bodies unpredictably. That disappointment creates the final escalation because Squidward begins interfering with the technology in an attempt to recover the attention without accepting the condition that originally came with it. The separator was introduced as a route back to safety, but Squidward now treats the same process as a way to recreate the unusual body that made people notice him. His choice turns a technological accident into a second disaster, driven by something much older in his character, since the desire for recognition has followed Squidward through the series long before Sandy's machine entered his life. The ending reveals the result through a much larger fusion containing SpongeBob, Squidward, and several familiar characters inside one deformed mass. Individual faces and body parts remain visible enough for the audience to recognize who has been caught in the accident, while the clear boundaries that normally separate one person from another have almost disappeared. A therapist sits across from the combined creature in an ordinary office setting, treating the aftermath as something that now has to be discussed, even though the basic physical question of where one person ends and another begins has become harder than ever to answer. The first fusion gives the strongest evidence for what may be happening inside that final body, because SpongeBob and Squidward clearly retain separate personalities while sharing one form. They speak independently, want different things, and respond to the condition as two people rather than as a new single character. The final mass does not provide the same access to every person inside it, so the theory has to stop before claiming that all of them remain fully conscious in exactly the same way. Their recognizable faces support the idea that individual identities remain present in some form. The episode never explains how awareness, sensation, or control work once the fusion expands beyond the original pair. The therapist's office sharpens the final image because the setting is built for individual people to describe private thoughts, feelings, and conflicts through conversation. Placing the fused mass there creates an immediate practical question the episode never answers about who is speaking for whom and whether each trapped person can express a separate experience. The scene does not need to explain pain, shared memory, or sensory overlap to feel disturbing, since the ordinary act of attending therapy already assumes boundaries the final body no longer has. Familiar faces remain visible, but the social tools used to treat them as separate individuals have become much harder to apply. That uncertainty creates enough horror without inventing physical pain or medical suffering the episode never describes. The disturbing part is already visible in the mismatch between mental identity and physical boundaries. SpongeBob and Squidward remain themselves during the first accident, yet neither can occupy a private body, and the final image multiplies that condition across several characters while withholding any clean explanation of who controls the shared form. The therapist can listen to whatever the fused group is able to communicate, but the credits arrive before the story shows how Sandy might reverse such a complicated result. The machine also changes the meaning of SpongeBob and Squidward's usual relationship because their conflict normally depends on the possibility of distance. Squidward can complain that SpongeBob is too close, precisely because moving away remains possible, and SpongeBob can follow because they still occupy separate bodies and homes. The teleportation accident removes that ordinary boundary and turns every disagreement into something the shared body has to carry. Squidward cannot simply go home when SpongeBob annoys him, and SpongeBob cannot give him privacy by stepping into another room, so restoring two bodies becomes the only real way to restore choice. Public approval then makes that restoration emotionally complicated for Squidward, who has spent years wanting other people to take his art seriously. The fused creature gives him exactly the kind of attention he rarely receives, but the audience is responding to the abnormal spectacle as much as the performance itself. Once Sandy separates them, Squidward faces a result he cannot comfortably accept because normality gives him control while removing the recognition he wanted. His attempt to interfere with the machine shows how an unwanted condition can become tempting once it provides a reward tied to a long-standing insecurity. The episode's connection to older transformation stories also becomes easier to see without turning that influence into proof of hidden canon. Science fiction has often used machines that accidentally combine living bodies, and SpongeBob Tentacle Pants places the same basic fear inside SpongeBob's elaborate plastic cartoon world. Sandy's technology is supposed to move bodies safely, yet one mistake causes the machine to lose track of where one person should end and another should begin. The comedy comes from SpongeBob and Squidward arguing through the result, but the identity problem underneath the joke remains clear because both minds continue speaking from inside a body neither chose. Sandy's molecular separator ray becomes the central object because it represents both recovery and danger during different parts of the story. At first, it is the only clear route back to individual bodies, allowing SpongeBob and Squidward to regain the physical separation their minds have retained throughout the accident. Later, Squidward's interference turns the same technology into part of the path toward an even larger fusion, showing that the machine's power is only useful when the people operating it respect what it can do. The device can restore a boundary, but it can also destroy that boundary again when someone reaches for the result without accepting the risk. The final therapist scene provides fallout instead of a complete cure, which follows the same pattern seen in I Was a Teenage Gary. Later episodes obviously restore every character to a normal design because the series continues, yet this story ends while the physical disaster is still active and never shows the exact repair. That allows the episode to close on the identity problem rather than solving it immediately. The audience leaves with visible evidence that several people can occupy one body and with incomplete information about what each of them experiences from inside it. The strongest conclusion, therefore, stays with what the machine proves. Sandy's technology can physically merge living characters. SpongeBob and Squidward remain mentally distinct during the first fusion, and the process can expand until several recognizable people are trapped inside one shared form. The final mass never gives enough information to describe every mind inside it, which makes uncertainty part of the evidence, rather than an invitation to invent a definite answer. The episode has already taken the loss of personal space far enough by turning a neighbor Squidward normally wants several feet away from him into someone occupying the same body. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sandy's machine keeps separate personalities visible after their bodies collapse together. Across Bikini Bottom, another threat reverses that fear by leaving familiar bodies walking around normally while the people who belong inside those lives have been hidden somewhere else. Section 5. The Day Bikini Bottom Was Replaced. Planet of the Jellyfish. Of the jellyfish. SpongeBob knows his friends well enough to notice when familiar behavior starts feeling wrong. That trust becomes dangerous when copies begin using the right faces, voices, and routines while the real residents disappear from ordinary life. This is the story of how a quiet replacement spreads through Bikini Bottom, forcing SpongeBob to decide which familiar people are still themselves and where the originals have gone before the copies become impossible to separate from the everyday life continuing around them. Planet of the Jellyfish appeared during SpongeBob SquarePants Season 8 in March 2012, and its central threat is unusually direct for a horror theory because an alien jellian presence begins replacing residents with copies. SpongeBob does not receive that explanation immediately, since the invasion first reaches him through changes in familiar behavior rather than through a public attack. Patrick can still look like Patrick and move through the neighborhood without exposing himself as something else, while Gary can still look like the pet SpongeBob recognizes, even if some part of his behavior feels wrong. Bikini Bottom is already full of unpredictable people, which gives the copies room to hide because one strange reaction does not automatically prove that a friend has been replaced. The Krusty Krab expands the problem from SpongeBob's home into the wider city as Squidward, Mr. Krabs, customers, and other residents begin fitting the same pattern. The restaurant continues operating, orders can still be taken, familiar faces remain behind the counter, and the building itself looks exactly as it did before the invasion, which makes the threat different from an open monster attack that empties the streets. Everyday life can continue long enough to hide the fact that the people occupying those roles may no longer be the originals, and SpongeBob's knowledge of his friends becomes useful only after enough repeated details begin showing that the changes are connected. The replacement spreads effectively because the copies do not need to reproduce every detail of the original person from the first second. SpongeBob already expects Patrick to act strangely, expects Squidward to be irritated, and expects Mr. Krabs to care about the restaurant, so a copy can survive early suspicion by staying close to broad habits while failing at smaller ones. That creates a useful asymmetry for the invasion. The Jellians only need to look familiar long enough to avoid immediate resistance, while SpongeBob has to notice a repeated difference across several people before he can justify treating his own friends as possible enemies. That progression also keeps the audience close to SpongeBob's point of view because certainty arrives only after the pattern has become too consistent to ignore. He moves from unease to testing to discovery and finally to rescue, so the theory grows from the same evidence he receives instead of from information supplied outside the story. Mayonnaise becomes the first concrete clue because the copies repeatedly avoid it. One strange food preference would mean little in a town where Patrick can enjoy almost anything and Squidward can reject food simply because SpongeBob is involved, but the same reaction information appearing across multiple people creates a pattern that individual personality cannot easily explain. When a normal customer asks for extra mayonnaise and becomes a target, SpongeBob gains evidence that the condiment is connected directly to the replacement process. Suspicion can now move beyond the feeling that friends seem different because one shared weakness is appearing across bodies that should have separate tastes, habits, and reactions. Gary raises the stakes because he cannot explain a mismatch through normal conversation. The first replacement at SpongeBob's home also absorbs Gary and a nearby plant together, producing a copy that carries features from both targets. SpongeBob depends on routine, sound, movement, and familiarity to understand his pet, which means a replacement that looks like Gary can hide behind the fact that Gary never gives spoken answers about what he is feeling. When the same broader pattern begins appearing in people who can talk, the problem becomes easier to compare across relationships. The invasion therefore moves from the most intimate spaces of SpongeBob's life into the public city, showing that no single home, workplace, or friendship remains isolated once the copying process is underway. Sandy becomes especially important once SpongeBob finds her, because the invasion has made appearance unreliable enough that neither character can automatically trust the other. Sandy has avoided replacement, but she still tests SpongeBob through a familiar physical reaction, using tickling to confirm that the person in front of her responds like the friend she knows. The test remains comic, yet it shows how relationships change once copies become possible. A face and voice are no longer enough, so personal knowledge has to become active verification rather than passive recognition before SpongeBob and Sandy can safely work together. Their investigation eventually reveals the hardest evidence in the episode when SpongeBob discovers the original residents suspended in transparent green pods or cocoons. The real Patrick, Gary, Squidward, Mr. Krabs, and other citizens have been removed from ordinary life while copies continue occupying their places above them, which eliminates explanations involving mood, illness, or simple mind control. The invasion creates separate originals and replacements at the same time, turning familiar faces into masks worn by creatures that have enough surface similarity to keep homes, jobs, and relationships functioning, while the people who belong to those lives remain physically trapped elsewhere. The pods also reveal that replacement requires removal rather than simple imitation at a distance. The originals are stored where they cannot interfere with the copies using their faces, which suggests the invasion depends on controlling access to the real person as much as producing a convincing duplicate. That physical separation explains why the copies can occupy homes and jobs without constantly confronting the people they replaced. It also gives SpongeBob a concrete rescue goal after much of the episode has been built around suspicion, because identifying the copies is only half the problem once the real population has to be found and released. That discovery gives Planet of the Jellyfish a cleaner identity problem than the fusion in SquidBob Tentacle Pants. Sandy's machine destroys bodily separation while leaving two recognizable minds inside one form, whereas the Jellians preserve separate bodies and outward appearances well enough for the wrong creature to occupy a person's social position. SpongeBob can look at someone who appears to be Patrick and still have the real Patrick hanging in a pod somewhere else. The fear comes from learning that recognition can succeed at the level of face and body while still failing at the level of the person who should be there. SpongeBob and Sandy eventually turn the mayonnaise clue into a weapon after discovering that the Jellians cannot tolerate it. The same behavior that exposed the copies now provides the practical method for defeating them, allowing the story to build its solution from evidence gathered earlier rather than introducing an unrelated weakness at the last moment. The fight escalates toward the Jellian leader, and warmed mayonnaise becomes part of the final attack, preserving SpongeBob's usual absurdity even while the conflict involves an entire population being captured and replaced. Mayonnaise works well as the countermeasure because it begins as a tiny behavioral detail rather than an obvious weapon. SpongeBob does not receive a manual explaining Jellian biology, so the weakness emerges from observation and repetition. Once he notices that unrelated copies share the same avoidance, the condiment becomes a way to test a theory against action. The later attack therefore grows directly from the same evidence that first made the replacements visible, and the absurdity of fighting an alien takeover with mayonnaise keeps the story inside SpongeBob's comic world without weakening the fact that an entire town has already been physically removed from daily life. Destroying the copies allows the originals to return, which gives the story a clear rescue without requiring the episode to answer every question about the creatures' inner lives. The real residents can resume the roles the Jellians occupied, and Bikini Bottom returns to its familiar social structure after the invasion is defeated. What remains uncertain is how much the copies actually understand about the identities they imitate. The episode never gives a private view inside a Jellian mind, so there is no evidence showing whether a copy believes it is Patrick, remembers Patrick's life, knows it is pretending, or operates through a simpler form of alien control. That missing information should remain unresolved because the pods already prove the most important part of the theory. The originals exist separately from the copies, which which means replacement is literal within the episode and does not depend on metaphor or fan interpretation. The Jellians can imitate enough appearance and behavior to move through Bikini Bottom without immediate detection, but copied memories, stolen souls, or perfect consciousness would require information the story never gives. The horror survives without those additions, because a replacement does not need a complete inner life to take someone's place convincingly enough for friends and co-workers to keep interacting with it. The invasion works because everyday trust usually depends on shortcuts. People recognize a familiar face, hear a known voice, watch someone follow a normal routine, and continue with the day without testing whether the mind behind that behavior still belongs to the same person. The Jellians exploit those shortcuts, and SpongeBob is especially vulnerable because he wants to trust Patrick, Gary, Mr. Krabs, and the people around him. Patrick acting oddly may invite another joke, Gary behaving differently may invite concern, and Squidward being cold or impatient barely seems unusual, giving the copies enough normal variation to hide inside. Sandy's verification method shows how that trust changes after the invasion becomes known. She does not rely on appearance alone, because appearance is exactly what the enemy can reproduce, so she checks a reaction connected to SpongeBob's individual body and personality. That moment allows friendship itself to become evidence, since knowing someone deeply can reveal differences a casual observer might miss. The episode keeps the idea simple enough for comedy, while still showing that a copied face becomes less useful once the people around it know what behavior to test. The story also draws clearly from older body replacement horror, especially the fear that a community can remain outwardly normal while the people inside it are being replaced. SpongeBob translates that structure into jellyfish, mayonnaise, pods, and cartoon comedy, yet the central tension remains recognizable because the invasion is most effective before anyone starts screaming. A quiet restaurant where every familiar person behaves slightly wrong becomes more dangerous than an obvious battlefield because the copies depend on normal life continuing around them. Mr. Krabs restores some of that normal life almost immediately after the rescue by finding a business use for leftover Jellian material and selling it as relish. His reaction turns part of the invasion back into a product, which is exactly the kind of behavior SpongeBob expects from him, and therefore becomes a small sign that the familiar character has returned. The joke also shows how quickly Bikini Bottom can absorb something horrifying into its usual routines, allowing a substance connected to population replacement to become another ingredient once the immediate danger is over. Patrick provides the final uneasy callback when he asks for food without mayonnaise, repeating the preference that previously exposed the copies. SpongeBob and Squidward respond with suspicion because the episode has trained them to hear an ordinary condiment request as possible evidence of replacement, yet nothing confirms that Patrick has been captured again. The originals were restored, and the story does not show another pod or new Jellian attack after the leader is defeated, so the line works best as a final reminder that trust can remain damaged even after the threat is gone. The ending therefore preserves both the rescue and the uncertainty it created. SpongeBob gets his friends back, the population returns, and the invasion can end as a completed story, but he now knows that familiar bodies can continue performing ordinary roles while the real people are hidden elsewhere. That knowledge changes how one small behavior feels without proving that every future oddity means another replacement. Patrick can simply dislike mayonnaise in that moment, but SpongeBob has earned a reason to look twice. The transparent pods remain the strongest image because they settle the factual question the theory cares about most. The originals are physically elsewhere while duplicates occupy their lives, which means Bikini Bottom really is replaced during the episode even though the process is temporary. The Jellian's consciousness stays unanswered, the final Patrick joke stays ambiguous, and the invasion ends without becoming permanent continuity. Yet none of those limits weaken what SpongeBob actually discovers. The people he knows were removed, copies took their places, and the city kept functioning long enough for the replacement to hide behind familiar faces. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Jellians create false versions of familiar people inside the cartoon and nearly pass for the originals. Years later, an unofficial horror version of Squidward created outside the show crossed the opposite boundary and appeared during a real Nickelodeon broadcast. Section 6. The creepypasta Nickelodeon put on television. SpongeBob in Randomland Squidward's frustration and isolation made him an easy target for darker fan stories, long before the official cartoon acknowledged them. Years after one fake Lost episode turned a corrupted Squidward face into a famous internet image, a real Nickelodeon broadcast showed something strikingly similar. This is the story of how fan-made SpongeBob horror crossed into the official series for a few seconds on television, creating a real broadcast reference, while the production still kept the legend itself outside Squidward's actual history. SpongeBob in Randomland aired during Season 12 in September 2019, and its story follows SpongeBob and Squidward as they attempt to complete a delivery inside a place where normal spatial rules, objects, and cause and effect stop behaving reliably. SpongeBob accepts the nonsense with his usual curiosity. curiosity, while Squidward wants to finish the job and leave, giving the episode a simple contrast between someone comfortable with absurdity and someone searching for a rule he can trust. Randomland keeps denying that search by making doors, spaces, creatures, and objects behave unpredictably, which prepares the audience to accept strange images before the horror reference ever appears. Randomland is a useful setting for the reference because the episode has already removed the expectation that every image must belong to ordinary continuity. SpongeBob and Squidward move through spaces that can change without warning, so the door sequence can place a familiar bedroom beside something impossible without requiring a long explanation of how the locations connect. That flexibility gives the production a safe place to acknowledge a famous horror image while keeping the story's internal logic intact. The reference can appear, register, and disappear as one more violation of normal space because Randomland has established that unpredictability as the rule. A wall of doors becomes one of the episode's recurring devices because each opening can reveal something with little connection to what a normal room should contain. The sequence teaches the audience that a door does not promise an ordinary destination, so Squidward can keep opening them while the episode keeps changing tone. One door briefly offers something far more familiar when it appears to show Squidward's bedroom, a private location connected to the part of his life he normally controls. That familiarity lasts only long enough for static and distortion to take over, replacing the room with a frightening image of Squidward marked by red eyes and dark streaks beneath them before the episode quickly continues. Viewers who had spent years around SpongeBob internet culture recognized the visual immediately because a creepypasta commonly called Squidward's Suicide or Red Mist had circulated online since around 2010, giving the image almost a decade to spread before the 2019 broadcast. The story belonged to the lost episode tradition, where fanfiction pretends that a disturbing piece of familiar media was produced, hidden, banned, or witnessed under unusual circumstances. Its power depended on borrowing SpongeBob's existing world and claiming there was another episode beyond normal distribution, one that contained material audiences were never supposed to see. The Squidward version became especially durable because images associated with the story spread farther than the full text itself. A corrupted face with red eyes could circulate through videos, fan art, forum discussions, edits, and retellings even among people who never read the original creepypasta from beginning to end. The image eventually became part of SpongeBob's wider online horror culture, allowing the visual to carry a history on its own. None of that made the supposed lost episode real, because there was no verified Nickelodeon broadcast corresponding to the fan story, but the repeated image became recognizable enough that the official production could later use it as a reference. The creepypasta's history also shows how fan material can become recognizable through repetition, even when there is no single official version controlling it. Different retellings, images, videos, and summaries can circulate until a simplified set of visual cues becomes more famous than the details of the original text. In this case, red eyes and a damaged-looking Squidward face became enough to signal the legend to people who knew it. That kind of recognition explains why the television reference can be brief. The episode does not need to retell the fan story because the people most likely to recognize the image already bring years of internet context with them. That is what makes the Randomland moment unusual. The original creepypasta claimed a hidden piece of SpongeBob footage existed somewhere outside normal television history, while the 2019 episode placed a related horror image inside an actual Nickelodeon production that viewers really could watch. A fake legend about forbidden SpongeBob material had produced a visual language strong enough for the real show to borrow from it, creating a reversal where fan culture no longer depended only on material taken from SpongeBob because SpongeBob itself was now borrowing something back. The appearance still needs a clear boundary around it because an official reference does not import the entire creepypasta into canon. SpongeBob in Randomland never says Squidward experienced the events from the fan story, never treats the image as a historical memory, and never uses red mist to explain how Randomland functions. The disturbing face appears among many impossible sights in a place already designed to produce visual nonsense, which allows viewers familiar with the legend to recognize the reference, while viewers without that background can simply understand it as another unsettling image behind a door. Production commentary makes that limit even clearer. Vincent Waller publicly addressed the reference and described the crew as poking fun at dark SpongeBob fanfiction, while also making clear that the fan story was far from canon. That statement gives a direct answer to one of the easiest exaggerations surrounding the episode. The artists knew what they were referencing and deliberately used the image, but awareness and canon are separate things. The official show acknowledged a famous piece of fan horror without rewriting Squidward's history to include the full creepypasta. The shot developed an unusual history after the original airing because later United States versions of the same episode replaced the red mist image with baby Squidward. That replacement began appearing in US reruns on November 11, 2019, less than 2 months after the September premiere. Production comments and community archival work book have connected that change to a standards and practices issue, while different territories and releases have carried different versions over time. That variation creates a situation where two viewers can watch the same SpongeBob episode and encounter different images behind the same door, which feels strangely close to the kind of unstable media history lost episode stories often pretend to describe. The later edit adds another layer, because changing one frame can alter how future viewers understand the episode's relationship with the legend. Someone who sees the Baby Squidward version first may hear about Red Mist later and assume the connection was exaggerated, while someone who saw the original broadcast may remember the reference as an unmistakable part of the episode. Both experiences can exist because distribution changes which version reaches which audience. That difference resembles the uncertainty creepypastas imitate, but here, the uncertainty comes from documented version changes rather than from a supposed secret tape that only one anonymous witness ever encountered. The difference is that Randomland's original frame has a real production and broadcast trail. The image was part of an actual episode, its reference was publicly acknowledged, and the later replacement has been documented, rather than surviving only through anonymous claims from someone who supposedly saw forbidden footage. The change therefore does not support a cover-up or hidden canon theory, because ordinary television editing already explains why versions differ. The real history becomes interesting precisely because it resembles the structure of a creepypasta without requiring any conspiracy to make that resemblance work. Creator intent is unusually useful here because the production comment addresses exactly the point fan discussion tends to blur. The crew's decision to reference the image confirms awareness, while the statement that the fan story remained outside canon limits what that awareness means. Those two facts can exist together without conflict. An official artist can borrow a famous unofficial image because it has become part of the franchise's culture, yet the borrowed image can remain a joke about fandom rather than a declaration that the events behind the image happened to Squidward inside the show's history. The bedroom setting sharpens the reference because Squidward's home usually represents the private space he tries to protect from SpongeBob and everyone else. Randomland briefly offers him a version of that familiar room, then corrupts it with an image created by years of fan horror surrounding his character. The visual therefore arrives inside a place associated with Squidward's own identity, rather than inside an unrelated abstract background, making the crossover between official and unofficial imagery feel more personal, even though the episode never explains it as a memory or event from his real life. The later Baby Squidward replacement also shows how detachable the reference is from the larger plot. SpongeBob and Squidward continue through Randomland, regardless of which image appears, because the delivery story does not depend on Red Mist being true. That flexibility helps define the reference accurately. It is an intentional visual joke placed inside an episode whose narrative remains complete without it. If the creepypasta had become actual canon, removing its only image should create a major story problem. Yet the episode continues with the same basic meaning because Randomland only needs the door to reveal something unexpected. The timing adds another layer because the reference appeared after years of online circulation rather than when the creepypasta was new. By 2019, SpongeBob had existed long enough for fan interpretations to develop their own images, stories, repeated myths, and shared memories around the franchise. The production could therefore encounter fan culture as part of SpongeBob's wider environment, creating a feedback loop where material invented by viewers becomes recognizable enough to be acknowledged by the people making the show. A long-running cartoon can eventually respond to the unofficial culture that has grown around it, and Randomland provides one of the clearest examples. That makes the Randomland frame a different kind of horror evidence from the earlier sections. Graveyard Shift and Planet of the Jellyfish ask what happened inside Bikini Bottom, while this section asks what happened between the official series and the audience around it. The unsettling part comes from watching a boundary in media history become temporarily porous. Fans created a forbidden SpongeBob image. The image became famous enough to reach the people making SpongeBob, and the official show eventually sent a version of that image back through television, where it could now be mistaken for proof of the legend that inspired it. Squidward fits that process especially well because the original series already allows him to move through emotional territory that fan horror can easily exaggerate. He can be isolated, angry, frightened, humiliated, tired, and miserable while remaining part of a comedy, giving unofficial stories familiar traits they can stretch toward darker outcomes. The Red Mist image became effective because it looked like a corrupted extension of a character people already recognized, and Randomland only needs a few seconds to activate that history because the audience familiar with the creepypasta brings the rest of the meaning into the scene. The section does not need the graphic material associated with some versions of the fan story because the theory being tested concerns broadcast history and canon rather than shock value. The useful facts are much simpler. The creepypasta was unofficial. The corrupted Squidward image became widely recognizable. SpongeBob in Randomland deliberately referenced that visual, and the production drew a clear line between the joke and canon. Later edits changed the image in some some releases, creating a documented version difference that resembles a lost episode rumor without making the original fanfiction real. That distinction becomes the strongest part of the theory because it separates two claims that are often blended together. The legendary hidden episode remained fiction, but the official frame referencing its most famous image was real. A fan could therefore spend years seeing fake SpongeBob horror presented as forbidden material and later watch a genuine Nickelodeon episode briefly reproduce part of the same visual mythology. The crossover happened at the level of recognition and production, not at the level of Squidward's canon biography. The door becomes the best object to carry the ending because it represents the boundary the episode crosses for only a moment. On one side is a fan legend claiming that disturbing SpongeBob footage existed somewhere outside the official series, while on the other side is a real episode willing to borrow that legend's face for a joke. Squidward opens the door, unofficial horror becomes official imagery for a few seconds, and Randomland closes the connection again before the fan story can become part of his actual history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Randomland lets fan-made horror enter official SpongeBob as one brief image while keeping the legend outside canon. Years earlier, Squidward reached a stranger place through a freezer and a broken time machine, arriving somewhere with almost nothing left around him. Section 7. The place outside time that Squidward should never have found. SB-129 Squidward usually treats distance as the easiest way to escape SpongeBob and Patrick when he wants time alone. One attempt at privacy carries him 2,000 years forward, then into prehistory, before a damaged time machine leaves him somewhere that resembles neither era. This is the story of how Squidward keeps traveling farther from the neighbors he wanted to avoid, until he reaches a blank place with almost nothing to identify where, or even when, he has arrived. SB-129 first aired during SpongeBob SquarePants Season 1 on December 31st, 1999, and it begins with a familiar conflict on Conch Street. SpongeBob wants Squidward to go jellyfishing. Patrick joins him, and Squidward wants enough privacy to practice his clarinet without another invitation coming through the door. The problem remains ordinary until Squidward learns that the Krusty Krab is closed for Sunday and decides the empty restaurant can give him the quiet his own house cannot. SpongeBob and Patrick eventually search for him there, causing Squidward to hide inside the freezer until they leave, but when he tries to come out, he discovers the door has frozen shut. Squidward expects the accident to remain temporary because someone should eventually return to the restaurant, yet the episode stretches that wait beyond any ordinary rescue. Time continues around the freezer, while Squidward remains preserved inside, allowing the Krusty Krab and the rest of Bikini Bottom to change without him, until the door finally opens 2,000 years later. He wakes inside a chrome-covered future, where the restaurant remains recognizable enough for him to understand where he is, but nearly everything surrounding that familiar shell belongs to a world he has never seen. Spongetron appears as one of the first people Squidward meets, followed by additional Spongetron figures and a future Patrick counterpart, which gives the distant world recognizable shapes even after 2 millennia of change. The future should have solved Squidward's original problem through sheer distance, because the SpongeBob and Patrick who bothered him on Sunday morning belong to ancient history, yet the patterns connected to them have survived. Jellyfishing still exists. SpongeBob-shaped figures still approach him, and Squidward finds himself dealing with versions of the same irritation in a city that has changed almost everything else. The future is especially frustrating for Squidward because it gives him proof that time has changed almost everything except the pattern he wanted to escape. Chrome covers the environment. Technology has advanced beyond what he knows, and the people around him belong to a world separated from his own by 2,000 years. Yet SpongeBob-shaped figures still occupy his attention, and jellyfishing remains recognizable. Squidward has achieved a distance no ordinary neighbor could ever create, but the future turns that distance into another version of the same social problem. The details have changed, while the irritation remains familiar enough for him to understand immediately. A time machine gives him the chance to escape the future, but Squidward chooses to travel in the opposite direction and arrives in a prehistoric sea long before the roads, houses, restaurants, and routines of modern Bikini Bottom exist. Primitive versions of SpongeBob and Patrick appear there as well, lacking normal speech, but carrying enough of the familiar shapes and curiosity for Squidward to recognize the resemblance. The new era seems empty enough to offer another chance at privacy, yet the same basic problem follows him because the primitive pair remain interested in what he is doing, especially once his clarinet and the local jellyfish become part of the scene. When the primitive characters struggle with jellyfish, Squidward uses his own knowledge to create simple nets and demonstrate how jellyfishing works. The action makes sense from his perspective, because years around SpongeBob and Patrick have taught him the hobby, even though he dislikes it, but the scene creates a much larger problem once the episode returns to the present. Squidward has traveled into the distant past while carrying knowledge from his own time, then given that knowledge to early versions of the two people most closely associated with the activity. His attempt to escape jellyfishing has placed him directly inside its origin, prehistory. prehistory reverses that frustration, because Squidward enters a world where the activity he hates has not yet become part of the culture. Primitive SpongeBob and Patrick do not arrive with nets and practiced routines, so for a moment, Squidward stands in an era before one of his most familiar annoyances has been established. His own knowledge then becomes the bridge that brings the hobby into that setting. The irony grows directly from his competence. He knows enough about jellyfishing to teach it even though he dislikes it, which means years of resisting SpongeBob and Patrick have still made him capable of passing their favorite activity backward through time. Before that loop becomes clear, the primitive world gives Squidward another reason to leave. When his clarinet playing angers or frightens the creatures around him, he rushes back toward the time machine while being chased, damages the controls in the panic, and loses the ability to choose a normal destination. The machine begins moving through strange images before stopping somewhere that looks unlike the future or the past, leaving Squidward to step into a white space with only a few scattered visual pieces and almost none of the landmarks that made the other eras understandable. The location, commonly called Nowhere, gives Squidward the complete absence he thought he wanted at the beginning. There are no buildings, roads, plants, customers, co-workers, jellyfish, neighbors, or familiar voices, which means SpongeBob and Patrick cannot interrupt him, and no part of Bikini Bottom's normal routine can reach him. For a brief moment, the quiet feels like success, because every irritation from Sunday morning has disappeared with the rest of the world. But the emptiness soon becomes a different kind of problem once Squidward realizes there is no landmark showing where he is, no resident to question, and no normal direction that promises a way out. Nowhere removes even the repeated SpongeBob and Patrick shapes that followed Squidward through the future and past. The place does not confront him with enemies, monsters, or visible danger, which makes his growing distress come from absence rather than attack. He cannot measure how far he has traveled, identify what era surrounds him, or use another person as proof that normal rules still apply. The quiet he wanted at the start now removes orientation, company, and any clear path home, turning privacy into a condition where Squidward can no longer tell what the world around him is supposed to be. The episode never gives Nowhere a technical explanation, and that missing information should remain part of the theory rather than being replaced by a definite answer. Squidward reaches the place through a damaged time machine, which makes it reasonable to wonder whether he has fallen outside normal time, entered some kind of broken destination, or reached a space that exists between recognizable eras. The story confirms only that he can enter it, move through it, experience it as separate from the future and past, become desperate to leave, and eventually return to the machine. Labels such as afterlife, alternate universe, or confirmed dimension would go beyond anything the episode provides. The future and past make the blank space more unsettling because both earlier destinations still contain enough life for Squidward to understand his position. Spongetron can answer questions in the future, primitive creatures can react to him in the past, and recognizable objects give both eras a sense of place even when he dislikes being there. Nowhere removes those checks and leaves Squidward without another person whose knowledge can correct him, or an object that can reveal whether he has gone forward, backward, or somewhere outside the line entirely. Even the idea of being lost becomes difficult to measure when there is no mappable environment around him. Squidward eventually stops searching for a better era and asks to return home, allowing the time machine to take him back to Conch Street, where SpongeBob and Patrick are still close enough to annoy him. Their familiar houses, the street, Squidward's own home, and the same jellyfishing invitation restore the world he wanted to escape. But the episode has one more temporal problem waiting inside that return. When Squidward angrily asks who invented jellyfishing, SpongeBob and Patrick identify him, connecting the present-day hobby directly to the prehistoric lesson we already watched him give. His request to return home therefore carries more weight than simply choosing the present over an unpleasant future. Squidward has already tested distance in every direction available to him, first hiding inside a familiar restaurant, then waking thousands of years ahead, then traveling to a distant past, and finally reaching a location that does not resemble an era at all. None of those places gives him the controlled solitude he imagined when he entered the freezer. Home remains noisy and irritating, but it also contains landmarks, relationships, routines, and a position in time he can recognize without needing another machine to explain where he stands. The inventor reveal then changes how the whole trip can be read because Squidward's escape attempt has become part of the history he returns to. He began by trying to avoid jellyfishing for one afternoon, yet the journey places him in the position of teaching the activity before his own era existed. That does not prove the universe is forcing Squidward to create the thing he hates, because the episode never explains the mechanics that way, but it does confirm that his actions in the past are remembered in the present. The trip therefore leaves a historical consequence, even though Squidward himself returns to the same neighborhood personality he had at the beginning. That answer creates a causal loop the episode never completely explains. Squidward knows jellyfishing because it already exists in his present. Then he travels to the past and teaches the activity to primitive versions of SpongeBob and Patrick, allowing the present to remember him as the inventor. The story story never tells us whether Squidward changed history when he made those nets, or whether his journey was always part of the history that created the world he came from. Both possibilities leave cause and effect tangled, because his attempt to escape the hobby becomes part of the reason the hobby exists around him. That time loop has firmer evidence than any theory about nowhere, because the episode itself connects the events. The audience watches Squidward teach jellyfishing in the past, and then hears that he is remembered as the inventor after returning home. The unresolved part concerns the mechanism behind the loop, while the link between the two moments is built directly into the story. Nowhere works differently because the location is clearly real within the episode, but receives no explanation of its origin, position, or relationship to normal time. The two mysteries should therefore remain separate rather than being forced into one answer. Squidward's journey demonstrates that time travel can place him inside the origin of something he already knew, while the damaged machine can also carry him to a blank environment whose place on the timeline remains unknown. The first problem concerns cause and effect, while the second concerns where a person can go when the categories of past and future stop being useful. Combining them into one invented cosmology would make the episode sound more certain than it is. The white space also invites comparison with later SpongeBob episodes that use similar empty backgrounds, especially the string, but visual similarity cannot confirm that Squidward reaches the same location left after SpongeBob unravels the universe. The series never connects those places directly, so the stronger approach is to notice the echo while leaving the relationship open. SpongeBob has shown more than one route toward an environment where normal landmarks disappear, but the stories give those routes different causes and never tell the characters they have arrived at one shared dimension. Squidward returns from all of this without becoming permanently transformed as a character. He still dislikes jellyfishing, still finds SpongeBob and Patrick exhausting, and immediately wants to undo his role in creating the hobby once he learns what happened. The journey therefore does not need to become a simple lesson about appreciating his neighbors. Its stranger result is that Squidward can cross thousands of years trying to escape a familiar irritation and discover that his own actions are tied to the same routine he was running from. The jellyfishing net and the time machine become the two objects that carry the ending because each represents a different unresolved problem. The net links Squidward's present knowledge to the prehistoric past and closes the causal loop when SpongeBob later names him as the inventor, while the time machine remains the only recognizable object connecting him to nowhere after the damaged controls send him beyond any era he can identify. Squidward gets home, yet neither the loop nor the blank destination receives the kind of explanation that would make his journey feel safe or repeatable. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2,000 years ahead still gives Squidward a recognizable city and familiar descendants. SpongeBob later looks 1,000 years farther and finds his own shape surviving only as stone monuments whose visitors no longer know who created them. Section 8. The future where nobody remembers. SpongeBob, Spongehenge. SpongeBob is involved in nearly every part of Bikini Bottom life, making the idea of the city forgetting him difficult to imagine. A strange wind drives him into isolation and leads him to carve stone copies of himself to control the jellyfish following him. This is the story of how a temporary problem leaves behind monuments that survive for thousands of years, preserving SpongeBob's face long after future visitors have lost the name, purpose, and ordinary life that originally explained why they were built. Spongehenge appeared during SpongeBob SquarePants Season 5 in November 2007, and it begins with strong wind moving through Bikini Bottom in a way that affects SpongeBob differently because of the holes across his body. Air passing through him produces flute-like tones that attract nearby jellyfish, turning one of his most familiar physical traits into a beacon he cannot switch off. The problem quickly follows him through ordinary life because walking away from the jellyfish does not remove the source, and every new gust can produce the sound again. SpongeBob can change direction, hide, or try to continue toward work, but his own body keeps calling the swarm back whenever the wind reaches him. The jellyfish eventually interfere enough with SpongeBob's routine that he retreats into a cave, separating himself from the Krusty Krab, his neighbors, and the normal places that give his day's structure. The cave provides temporary shelter, but cannot solve the larger problem because SpongeBob still needs a way to exist outside without becoming the center of the swarm again. Isolation pushes him toward a different kind of solution when he begins working with stone, using his own body as the model for large figures whose shapes and holes can reproduce the same wind-driven tones that have been attracting the jellyfish to him. The first stone SpongeBob carves turns a personal problem into an object that can continue doing the same job after SpongeBob walks away. The statue cannot speak, work, think, or panic, but it can stand in the wind and produce enough of the sound to draw jellyfish toward itself. SpongeBob keeps building until the landscape contains several large copies arranged to redirect the swarm, allowing the living SpongeBob to escape the role his body had accidentally taken on. A practical solution has begun to look like a monument before the episode ever reaches the distant future, because the figures preserve SpongeBob's shape while separating that shape from everything else that makes him a person. one. SpongeBob's choice to carve himself is practical rather than ceremonial, which becomes crucial once the future scene turns the statues into objects that look as though they must have been created for a larger cultural purpose. He uses the shape he understands best because his own holes have already demonstrated which form produces the sound the jellyfish follow. The future visitors cannot see that trial and error. They encounter only the finished arrangement, so the most ordinary explanation has vanished while the most impressive physical evidence remains. The monuments therefore invite a grand interpretation precisely because the small problem that created them has been erased. The stone arrangement works because the jellyfish respond to the sound rather than to SpongeBob's identity, which allows the copies to keep performing one part of his accidental function without carrying any of his memories or intentions. That distinction becomes important later because the statues preserve exactly the kind of information stone can hold: shape, placement, holes, scale, and physical durability. They do not preserve the conversation that led SpongeBob into the cave, the weather that created the problem, the fear of being chased, or the reason he chose one arrangement instead of another. When SpongeBob eventually returns toward familiar parts of Bikini Bottom, he finds the Krusty Krab engulfed or buried in sand, creating one of the episode's most unsettling images without providing a complete explanation for what happened during the missing period. The familiar restaurant that usually anchors his life no longer looks like a place where he can simply resume a shift, and the surrounding world appears changed enough for fans to imagine much larger disasters. That image has helped produce theories involving extinction, a destroyed Bikini Bottom, or SpongeBob surviving after everyone else is gone, but the episode never shows a mass death or identifies a specific catastrophe. The absence of explanation matters because a buried restaurant does not provide enough evidence to reconstruct the fate of an entire city. The story does not show every resident dying, does not give a disaster report, and does not state that Bikini Bottom has been permanently wiped out. The sand-covered Krusty Krab can support uncertainty about what happened while SpongeBob was isolated, but the uncertainty should remain open rather than being filled with an apocalypse the episode never confirms. The stronger horror arrives later through information the story actually provides. The episode jumps 3,000 years into the future, where the stone SpongeBobs are still standing and alien visitors examine them as ancient objects. One alien even stops to photograph the statues while the group studies the site. The visitors can see the repeated figures, observe the arrangement, and notice the continuing connection to jellyfish, but they no longer know who made the monuments or why they were built. SpongeBob's physical likeness has survived across millennia, while the ordinary explanation that made the statues useful has disappeared, turning a solution to one windy day into an archaeological mystery. The gap between purpose and later interpretation also explains why the episode does not need to show a destroyed civilization for the ending to feel lonely. SpongeBob could have returned to normal life after the immediate crisis and still become forgotten 3,000 years later because individual memory does not survive automatically with an object. Names, stories, records, and relationships require their own forms of preservation. The statues provide none of that information by themselves. They preserve a face without a biography, which allows future visitors to stand directly in front of SpongeBob's likeness while remaining separated from him by a missing explanation they cannot recover from stone alone. That future scene creates a firmer and more interesting theory than claiming the whole population died. SpongeBob does not need to be shown dying for his identity to disappear from recorded understanding, because enough time can separate later visitors from the person who created an object even when the object itself survives. The aliens inherit the stones without the story that gave those stones meaning, leaving them with durable physical evidence and missing social context. SpongeBob has become recognizable as a repeated shape while becoming anonymous as a person. The title and visual design clearly draw from Stonehenge, one of the world's most famous ancient monument sites, where surviving structures allow later people to study construction and purpose, even though many questions about the builders and exact uses remain debated. Spongehenge turns that archaeological distance into a joke by giving the audience complete access to the origin while denying that information to the future visitors. We know that wind through SpongeBob's holes attracted jellyfish and that the statues were designed to redirect them, while the aliens can only examine what remains after 3,000 years have removed the original circumstances. The audience therefore occupies the missing position in the future record. We watch SpongeBob experience the problem, enter the cave, carve the figures, and discover how the arrangement worked, so the monuments never feel mysterious to us in the same way they do to the aliens. That difference creates the entire future horror, because the episode shows how easily a clear purpose can become unknowable once the person who understood it is no longer available to explain. Stone can preserve an outline far longer than memory preserves the life attached to it. The 3,000-year jump also expands the scale established by SB 129 without requiring both episodes to belong to one exact historical timeline. Squidward's future is 2,000 years ahead and still contains a chrome Bikini Bottom, a Krusty Krab, Spongetrons, and recognizable descendants of familiar life, while Spongehenge Stonehenge moves farther and presents monuments whose creator has been forgotten. SpongeBob continuity regularly changes its own future for individual stories, so forcing these episodes into one rigid chronology would create problems the series never asks the audience to solve. The stronger comparison comes from how each story imagines memory surviving through time. The monuments outlast SpongeBob's name because they preserve the part of him that can be carved into stone, while losing the fragile information that existed through speech, relationships, work routines, and shared memory. SpongeBob spends much of the series wanting to be a good employee, a good friend, a successful boating student, and an active member of nearly everything happening around him, yet none of those roles survives clearly in the future scene. His face remains enormous and visible, but the people studying it cannot connect the shape to the person whose daily life gave that face meaning. The final sound associated with SpongeBob should remain ambiguous for the same reason the buried Krusty Krab should remain limited to what is shown. A laugh or familiar audio cue can function as a joke, an echo, or a reminder of the character without proving that SpongeBob himself physically survived the entire 3,000 years. The episode never shows an ancient SpongeBob stepping forward to identify himself, which means the sound cannot carry a biological claim the visuals do not support. The aliens' ignorance remains the firmer evidence because they openly lack the creator's identity. The jellyfish migration gives the statues another kind of survival because their practical effect continues long after the reason for building them has disappeared from memory. The aliens describe that migration as annual, showing that the arrangement still performs its original function on a repeating cycle 3,000 years later. They can observe the surviving effect while remaining unable to reconstruct the personal problem that led SpongeBob to create the statues. Function survives more clearly than biography, which gives the episode an eerie picture of history where an object can keep doing its job after everyone has forgotten who designed it or what ordinary day first made that job necessary. The cave helps explain why that record is thin, because SpongeBob creates the solution largely in isolation rather than as part of a public project documented by Sandy, Mr. Krabs, Patrick, or the wider community. The monuments begin with little shared explanation attached to them, which makes it easier to imagine how later history could preserve the stones while losing the story. Once enough time passes, conversations disappear, records fail, places change, and the most durable surviving material becomes the thing future visitors are forced to interpret. The Krusty Krab and the statues therefore preserve opposite parts of SpongeBob's life. The restaurant carries years of daily meaning for him, but becomes physically obscured, while the statues carry almost none of his normal social life, yet remain visible across the long jump into the future. That reversal makes durability look almost accidental. The thing SpongeBob values every day is not necessarily the thing history keeps, and the thing he creates as a temporary tool can outlast the routines, friendships, and workplaces that mattered more to him when he was alive, in the present of the episode for them. The buried Krusty Krab provides a useful counter-image because a place central to SpongeBob's life becomes almost unreadable, while the statues he created for one temporary problem become the objects that survive clearly. The restaurant was built as a workplace and social center, yet sand reduces it toward the appearance of a ruin, while the stone copies were built as practical tools and eventually resemble sacred or historical monuments. Time separates both objects from their original functions and leaves later observers with shapes whose meaning must be reconstructed from whatever remains. Stonehenge therefore reaches its strongest horror through loss of context rather than a confirmed catastrophe. Something happens to Bikini Bottom during the unseen period, the Krusty Krab is buried, the stone figures remain, and 3,000 years pass before alien visitors encounter the monuments without knowing who made them. The missing years stay missing, which prevents the episode from confirming extinction, while also allowing the ending to show something more believable. History can lose a person long before it loses every remaining physical trace that person left behind. The wind becomes the best closing callback because it begins the chain and continues carrying SpongeBob's accidental signature after his story has disappeared from the future. Air through his body creates the original problem, air through stone copies provides the solution, and the same basic effect survives for thousands of years after the aliens can no longer name the builder. SpongeBob's face remains in stone, while the ordinary life behind that face has become inaccessible to the people looking at it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Stonehenge lets thousands of years erase the story around a few surviving objects. SpongeBob later finds a much faster form of erasure when one loose thread begins pulling apart Squidward's clothes, Bikini Bottom, and eventually everything surrounding them. Section 9. The thread, holding the universe together. The string SpongeBob likes fixing small problems as soon as he sees them, which makes a loose thread on Squidward's clothing hard to ignore. The thread keeps going after the fabric should have ended, and every pull takes larger pieces of the world with it. This is the story of how one attempt to remove a loose string grows from damaged clothing into a chain of destruction that reaches Bikini Bottom. The surface, space, and eventually the universe surrounding SpongeBob and Patrick. The string appeared during SpongeBob SquarePants Season 11 in November 2018, and it begins with an object too small to suggest the scale ahead. SpongeBob notices a loose thread on Squidward's clothing and decides to pull it, an action that makes sense inside ordinary experience because stray threads usually come free, snap, or reveal quickly that someone should stop before more fabric is damaged. Instead, Squidward's clothing begins to unravel while the string continues extending, giving SpongeBob a simple goal that becomes harder to abandon because an end still seems as though it must be waiting somewhere ahead. The problem expands beyond clothing as objects connected to the thread begin coming apart as though they are all made from the same continuous material. The visual joke keeps the string thin, familiar, and physically simple, while everything around it proves that the consequences no longer follow ordinary rules. SpongeBob does not need a machine, spell, weapon, or villainous plan to produce the destruction because the thread is already present and his only action is to keep pulling. Before the city disappears, the string removes Sandy's tail and the glass of her tree dome, while each replacement outfit Squidward buys is unraveled again. Each new object disappearing gives him another chance to stop, but it also suggests that the loose section may finally be close to its end. Bikini Bottom eventually begins unraveling through the same action, carrying the problem from one person's clothing into the physical environment shared by everyone. Buildings, streets, and familiar pieces of the city disappear into string rather than exploding or collapsing under an outside attack, which makes the destruction feel strangely orderly, even as the scale becomes enormous. The world is being converted into the same material SpongeBob has been collecting from the beginning, allowing one simple motion to connect things that should have no normal reason to share a single thread. The escalation stays readable because every larger consequence preserves the same visual action. SpongeBob does not learn a new technique when the string reaches the city, the surface, or space, so the audience can compare each stage directly with the first pull on Squidward's clothing. That repetition gives the destruction a clear cause even after the scale becomes impossible. A hand pulls, something disappears, and more string collects. The world changes around SpongeBob, while his action remains almost mechanically simple, which makes the final cosmic result feel like the uninterrupted continuation of a mistake that began small enough to fit between two fingers. That visual creates the theory at the center of the section, because the episode behaves as though reality contains a seam SpongeBob has accidentally found. Seam remains an interpretation rather than an official explanation, since nobody identifies the string as the material holding the universe together, and no character provides a scientific account of what SpongeBob has touched. The firm evidence is more limited and already strange enough. SpongeBob pulls one line, increasingly large parts of his physical world unravel into that line, and the same action continues working across scales where clothing, buildings, land, planets, and cosmic structures should have nothing in common. The destruction eventually reaches the surface, carrying SpongeBob beyond Bikini Bottom into the live-action world associated with Bikini Atoll. A fisherman and the boat beneath him become caught in the unraveling, and the island itself is pulled apart as the string continues away from the sea, crossing one of the franchise's usual visual boundaries without changing the mechanism. Cartoon objects underwater and live-action objects above the surface can both be reduced by the same pull, which suggests that whatever rule the string follows applies across parts of SpongeBob's world that normally look completely different. The string continues into space after the surface disappears, and the scale grows until the Milky Way and other cosmic structures become part of the unraveling. The episode does not introduce a new mechanism for each larger target because the same hand movement continues doing the work, allowing escalation to come entirely from size. SpongeBob keeps pulling, another layer of reality disappears, and the growing pile of string becomes a physical record of how far the original loose thread has reached. By the time the universe itself is involved, the first shirt is almost impossible to remember beside the size of the result. The lack of resistance also makes the string unusual. Buildings, land, and cosmic structures do not stop the pull or require SpongeBob to use greater force as the scale increases. So the episode treats size as irrelevant to whatever connection the thread has created. A shirt and a galaxy can both be reduced through the same motion. The scene itself reveals no direct scientific rule, yet it establishes that the string ignores distinctions that normally organize the physical world. Once the thread has reached something, the object behaves less like independent matter and more like another section of material waiting to be drawn into the growing pile. SpongeBob eventually pulls until nearly everything surrounding him is gone, leaving a white space and the accumulated string where the universe used to be. The high point arrives through the same goal that began the episode because SpongeBob finally reaches the end of the thread, achieving completion only after the task has expanded far beyond anything he understood when he started. The loose piece is finally gone because the world attached to it has been converted into material, turning SpongeBob's persistence into a cosmic disaster without requiring him to make any deliberate choice to destroy reality. Patrick then appears and notices another loose string on SpongeBob, returning the story to the tiny temptation that started everything. He stands in the same basic position SpongeBob occupied at the beginning, seeing a small imperfection and preparing to act without carrying the knowledge the audience has gained from watching the previous pull. The ending creates a possible cycle, because the danger still looks harmless before someone touches it, and the person reaching for the new thread has no reason to understand that a simple act of tidying may repeat the destruction at another scale. For a horror theory, the strongest claim is already visible enough that connecting the episode to real string theory would only weaken it. Real string theory is a complex framework in physics with no meaningful connection to a cartoon thread that can be pulled through a shirt, and the shared word does not provide evidence that SpongeBob is secretly describing actual cosmology. The more useful interpretation stays inside the episode's physical logic, where separate objects behave as though they can be converted into one continuous line, and the same line can pass through scales that normally contain one another. That makes the string different from the other dangerous objects in the video because it arrives without an established maker, warning, purpose, or control system. Sandy's machines are complicated inventions created by a scientist, the snail plasma is medicine designed for a specific patient, and the Jellians are organized invaders with a leader and a weakness. The thread simply appears on Squidward's clothing, leaving SpongeBob no obvious reason to believe he has touched anything more dangerous than a loose piece of fabric until the consequences are already spreading far beyond the room. SpongeBob's personality helps the problem continue without turning him into a villain because he likes finishing jobs, cleaning messes, and following simple tasks until they are complete. The thread gives those habits an impossible target, and stopping requires accepting an unfinished loose end, while continuing offers the promise that the end may be only one more pull away. Every new disappearance shows that the task is larger than he expected, but the structure remains familiar enough for him to continue chasing completion, long after the original reason for touching the thread has lost all importance. SpongeBob's continued focus on finding the end creates a useful contrast with the audience's widening view of the damage. He remains attached to the original task even after the surroundings show that completion has become more dangerous than leaving the thread alone. The episode does not need him to announce a reason for every pull, because the repeated behavior already shows the pattern. He started by trying to remove something loose, and each new length keeps suggesting that the task remains unfinished. The danger comes from applying a normal finishing instinct to an object whose scale cannot be understood from the small piece first visible on Squidward. The episode gives almost no ordinary fallout because the destruction has grown too large for Bikini Bottom to respond in its normal way. Once the universe is gone, there is no intact street where residents can gather, no Krusty Krab for SpongeBob to return to, and no normal environment where someone can explain what happened. Later episodes obviously restore the setting because the series continues, but the string itself never shows how that repair occurs, leaving another gap where franchise continuity confirms that the damage is temporary while the individual story ends before showing the reversal. The white aftermath naturally recalls Nowhere from SB-129 because both scenes place a character in a nearly empty environment after the normal rules of space or time have broken down. The similarity is worth noticing, yet the episodes never identify the two locations as the same place, so a direct canon connection would require information the show has never supplied. Squidward reaches Nowhere through a damaged time machine, while SpongeBob reaches the white aftermath after physically unraveling the universe. The images can echo one another without becoming one confirmed dimension. The surface sequence also prepares the final theory because the string physically passes through Bikini Atoll before continuing toward larger cosmic targets. Inside the string, that island is simply another part of the fictional destruction, yet the name points toward a real location whose history contains nuclear testing, displacement, and consequences far beyond anything the cartoon treats as a joke. The visual connection should remain separate from the next section's historical evidence, but it creates a natural path from SpongeBob's fictional destruction of Bikini Atoll toward the real history attached to the name. Within this episode, the theory should stay focused on the mechanism the audience can see. Nothing proves that a permanent cosmic string runs beneath every object in every SpongeBob story, and nothing proves that another character could always reproduce the same event on another day. Cartoon continuity changes too freely for one gag to become a permanent law of nature without additional support. The string confirms the rule only inside its own story. Where SpongeBob pulls, the world unravels, the scale grows from clothing to city to surface to galaxy, and the universe eventually disappears. The accumulated pile becomes the strongest closing image because it shows that the missing world has been converted rather than simply erased. Instead of leaving ruins, broken machines, or a visible explosion, the episode turns the universe into material gathered through one repeated action. Every pull adds to the pile while removing another piece of reality, allowing a tiny object to carry the physical record of destruction far larger than anything SpongeBob intended when he first reached toward Squidward's clothing. Patrick's appearance after the destruction also prevents the ending from giving SpongeBob exclusive control over the phenomenon. The loose thread is dangerous because because another person can encounter the same kind of visual cue and make the same ordinary decision without knowing the previous history. Patrick sees a string rather than a cosmic weapon, just as SpongeBob did, so the risk can begin again through ignorance rather than malice. The final gag, therefore, preserves the problem at the level where it started. A tiny object looks harmless, someone reaches for it, and the true scale of what is attached to that object remains invisible until pulling has already begun, and nobody understands what it can do. Patrick's final reach keeps the danger unresolved because cosmic destruction has not changed how harmless the next loose thread looks. He does not need to understand what happened before him to repeat the behavior that caused it, and the episode never gives the object a warning that another person could recognize. The universe can therefore be removed by a mechanism nobody has fully named, controlled, or explained, while the next person sees only the same simple invitation SpongeBob saw at the beginning. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The string reaches the surface and pulls apart Bikini Atoll before the universe disappears. That island carries a far heavier history outside the cartoon, and SpongeBob's oldest nuclear theory becomes stranger once the show's own creative history enters the discussion. Section 10. The nuclear theory that was hiding in the show's origin. Bikini Atoll SpongeBob treats Bikini Bottom as an ordinary home, even though its name connects the cartoon to a real place with a much heavier history. Fans used Bikini Atoll's nuclear testing past to build theories about mutation and a ruined surface world, and later production comments gave part of that idea stronger support. This is the story of how SpongeBob's oldest nuclear theory moved closer to the show's early creative thinking, while still falling short of a fixed origin for every character in Bikini Bottom. Bikini Atoll is a real atoll in the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean, and long before it became part of SpongeBob discussions, it was home to a Marshallese community whose history was permanently changed by the United States nuclear testing program. In 1946, the people of Bikini were relocated so the atoll could be used for weapons tests, with the move presented as temporary and accompanied by the expectation that residents would eventually be able to return. The tests that followed transformed that expectation into a much longer history of displacement, contamination, monitoring, and arguments over whether the land could safely support permanent resettlement again. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States conducted 23 nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll, including explosions with enormous destructive power and long-lasting environmental consequences. Roughly 167 Bikinians were displaced at the beginning of the testing period, first moving to places where food and living conditions created new hardships, while decisions about their original home remained tied to the nuclear program. A later effort to resettle Bikini did not provide a permanent solution because residents were removed again in 1978 after evidence showed unsafe internal radiation exposure, especially through locally produced food. Bikini has therefore remained connected to the consequences of testing long after the final detonation, with environmental monitoring, land use decisions, medical programs, compensation questions, and possible future resettlement continuing across generations. United States programs still monitor affected parts of the Marshall Islands and support decisions involving radiation, food, land, and health. That history matters before any SpongeBob theory enters the discussion, because Bikini is a real homeland whose people lived through displacement and its continuing effects, rather than a mysterious abandoned island that exists only as a dark reference for a cartoon. The fictional name Bikini Bottom makes that real connection difficult to ignore. SpongeBob's city sits below the ocean and is associated visually with Bikini Atoll, while its residents include talking sea creatures, unusual animals, strange technology, and bodies that regularly stretch ordinary biology. Fans used those pieces for years to build a simple theory in which nuclear testing on the surface caused mutations below, allowing SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, Mr. Krabs, and the rest of the cast to exist because radiation transformed sea life around the atoll. The theory became easy to repeat because several real and fictional details appeared to fit together. Nuclear tests really happened at Bikini Atoll. The cartoon city is called Bikini Bottom, and the characters behave unlike normal sea animals, which gives viewers a clear chain of associations before any creator comment is considered. From there, some versions of the theory expand into a complete apocalypse, where the surface world has been destroyed and Bikini Bottom survives as one of the few remaining communities after humanity is gone. Those larger versions have always created problems because SpongeBob repeatedly shows living humans and an active surface world. Fishermen, boats, beaches, islands, and other human elements appear across the franchise, and the string itself carries SpongeBob to the surface, where a living fisherman is caught in the unraveling before the destruction reaches space. A rigid timeline where all humanity disappeared before the series began cannot fit those scenes cleanly, which means the most extreme version of the theory was already weaker than the basic observation connecting Bikini Bottom's name to nuclear history. For many years, the cautious conclusion was that the theory worked as a clever fan connection supported by the setting's name and the show's taste for biological absurdity, but not as established canon. Earlier public comments had also pushed against treating every character as the direct result of nuclear testing, which encouraged a clear distinction between an interesting interpretation and a confirmed origin. The theory seemed likely to remain in that category until members of the SpongeBob cast and creative team discussed it during the show's 25th anniversary period. Hillenburg's path to SpongeBob also came through marine science. Before the series, he created The Intertidal Zone, an educational tide pool comic with a talking sponge. In a 2024 Esquire conversation involving people closely connected to the series, Mr. Lawrence, the voice of Plankton and a longtime SpongeBob writer, addressed the nuclear testing theory directly and described the atomic mutation idea as something that was part of the fun behind the show's conception. He also discussed an early version of the world where the surface had been devastated and Bikini Bottom remained below, connecting the post-apocalyptic idea to creative thinking around the series rather than to fan speculation that developed decades later. That production comment gives the theory far more support than any screenshot, background gag, or word association could provide on its own, because the atomic idea now has a direct connection to someone who helped build SpongeBob from its early years. Fans who linked Bikini Bottom to nuclear testing were therefore touching a concept that existed close to the show's development, even if later episodes never turned that concept into a strict piece of continuity. The theory did not originate entirely from viewers looking backward at the name, because at least one longtime writer has described mutation and an apocalyptic surface as part of the creative thinking surrounding the series. The finished cartoon places a clear limit around that production history through the world it continues to show. Fishermen, boats, beaches, islands, and other human elements remain part of SpongeBob's universe, and the string places a living fisherman above Bikini Bottom before the unraveling reaches the island in space. Those scenes do not fit cleanly with versions of the theory where humanity disappeared before SpongeBob's ordinary life began. The series also never assigns SpongeBob or his friends to individual nuclear tests, never gives a date when radiation supposedly changed them, and never identifies one radioactive event as the official explanation for every unusual body in town. SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, and other characters can stretch, transform, survive impossible injuries, and return to normal through the cartoon's usual rules. The production comment gives the atomic idea a documented place in the show's creative background, while the episodes leave the characters' exact biological origins largely undefined. That loose continuity matters because SpongeBob regularly allows one story to push the world much farther than another story needs to remember. A transformation can remain active at the end of one episode and disappear by the next. Bikini Bottom can be emptied, replaced, buried, or completely unraveled without later stories stopping to explain every repair. The surface can contain living people even after an earlier idea imagined a devastated world above the sea. Those resets make it difficult to turn an early development concept into a permanent law that every later writer had to follow. The same flexibility appears throughout these stories, where major physical changes can end without an on-screen repair or lasting timeline. Mr. Lawrence's comment establishes that atomic mutation and a ruined surface belong to the creative thinking around SpongeBob. The finished series then spent decades building stories whose continuity stayed flexible enough to contradict the strictest version of that idea whenever a new joke, setting, or adventure needed something different. The real history of Bikini Atoll carries consequences that cannot be treated with the same reset. 23 nuclear tests were conducted there between 1946 and 1958. Bikinians were displaced from their homeland, and later resettlement did not provide a lasting return because residents were removed again in 1978 after unsafe internal radiation exposure was identified. Monitoring and questions surrounding land, food, health, and possible resettlement continued long after the testing period ended. Those facts remain important even when the atoll is being discussed beside a cartoon, because Bikini was a home before its name became part of SpongeBob's setting. The creative connection can explain why nuclear ideas belong in a discussion of the show's origins. The displacement and contamination belong to the history of real people and continue carrying meaning beyond anything the fictional theory can add. Production knowledge can also change how older SpongeBob images look after the fact. Human objects falling into the sea, strange technology, extreme transformations, unusual sea creatures, or views of the surface may seem connected once atomic ideas are known to have existed around the show's development. A scene fitting that concept still cannot prove the scene was written as nuclear foreshadowing. The image may have been created for a joke, a visual gag, or a completely different story problem. Later continuity should be handled with the same care. Living humans weaken a rigid apocalypse timeline, yet those appearances do not erase the documented production idea that gave the theory a stronger foundation than fan wordplay alone. The evidence supports a narrow position. Nuclear history belongs to Bikini Atoll. Atomic mutation and surface devastation belong to early creative thinking around SpongeBob. And the finished cartoon never turns turns those ideas into a complete origin rule governing every episode. The name Bikini Bottom becomes the final object tying the theory together, because it has been present since the series began and never needed a hidden frame, lost script, or background message to be discovered. The connection sits in the name of SpongeBob's home, repeated casually across stories that usually care more about his job, friends, jellyfishing, and boating school than about why the city is called Bikini Bottom. Learning more about Bikini Atoll and the production ideas behind the show changes the weight carried by that familiar name without requiring the cartoon to explain it inside every episode. The real atoll also creates a contrast with the way SpongeBob handles consequences. Bikini Bottom can rebuild a restaurant, restore a transformed body, return a missing population, or bring the entire universe back between episodes without explaining every repair, because reset is part of the show's storytelling. Bikini Atoll cannot reset in that way. The effects of displacement and nuclear contamination stretch across generations, and continuing monitoring exists precisely because the consequences did not end when testing stopped in 1958. For that reason, the human history belongs in the foundation of this section rather than being held back as a dramatic final reveal. The surprise comes from Mr. Lawrence's production comment and what it means for the fan theory, while the people of Bikini should never become a twist used to make SpongeBob sound darker. Their displacement, failed return, and continuing relationship with the atoll are real events with their own importance, and the cartoon connection should remain secondary to that reality whenever both are discussed together. The final theory therefore lands in an unusual place compared with the others. It cannot be called a simple canon event, because SpongeBob never opens an episode by explaining that nuclear testing created every resident, yet it also cannot be dismissed as a coincidence invented entirely by fans after the fact. The real testing history sits behind the fictional name, and one of the franchise's longest-serving creative voices has connected atomic mutation and a post-apocalyptic surface directly to ideas surrounding the show's conception. That conclusion also brings the video back toward the kind of uncertainty that opened Graveyard Shift. Squidward's fake story turned out to be wrong about its monster, while still unfolding in a restaurant where something supernatural was real, and the nuclear theory spent years stretching beyond what later episodes could support, while still pointing toward a real idea from the show's creative background. In both cases, the strongest answer appears after the exaggerated version is reduced to the part the evidence can actually carry. Across all 10 theories, SpongeBob's horror grows from ordinary objects and situations already built into the cartoon: a light switch, a restaurant menu, a syringe, Sandy's machine, a familiar face, a bedroom door, a freezer, wind moving through SpongeBob's holes, a loose thread, and finally the name of the city itself. Each story becomes stranger as that ordinary detail expands beyond the role it normally plays, carrying the characters from ghost stories and body changes into replacement, broken time, forgotten history, cosmic destruction, and a real-world connection to nuclear testing. The theories do not all survive examination in the same way, which is exactly why treating them carefully makes the darker parts of SpongeBob easier to see. Some collapse when their evidence is restored to context, some remain unresolved because the episode stops before giving an answer, and others are openly shown on screen or supported by the people who helped create the series. Bikini Bottom remains a comedy built to exaggerate, reset, and move on, yet those resets cannot erase the strange images each story leaves behind once the joke is over. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.